Open heart, open mind. Welcome to the Sabah channel, the official platform of the Sabah project. My name is Shira Wong, the co-founder of the Sabah project.
And I'm Samiksha. So I also joined the part. I'm also a part of Satwa Youth, which is a program created by Satwa Project. So its main purpose is to bringing dharma to the youth.
So in Sabah project, we encourage mindful and positive approach in interdialogues to develop openness and embrace diversity in the multiple Buddhist traditions. We believe in the art of being with each other with the principle of thinking wisely and acting kindly. So before we start our program today, I would like to introduce our broadcast director, which is Brother Ray, and he's behind the scene, and we are thankful to him so much for operating this program for us today. And let us introduce you today's program by the name of Nobatara series, Impermanence and the Certainty of Change, Part 1. So I'd like to invite Samisha to introduce the moderator and speakers for today.
Thank you, Brother Sharaf. So the moderator for today's program is Sister Stacey Martin. Stacey Martin holds a master's degree in Sustainable International Development and undergraduate degree in Anthropology. She has over 20 years of experience providing program and grant management support to various non-profit organizations. She currently works as the content manager for the Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive, a non-profit archiving and disseminating the teachings of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche. We are very pleased to have Sister Stacey here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So, our first contributor of this program is Venerable Tenzin Dasel. Venerable Tenzin Dasel is a teacher and leader who has been practicing Buddhism and meditation for over 2 decades. She is the founder of Made Mindfulness Project and serves as the Buddhist spiritual advisor at Bates College and also the spiritual program coordinator at Tashigatse Link Buddhist Center. She holds many honors and distinctions for her work with women, children, and youth throughout the US, India, and the world. Oh, maybe Venerable Tenzin Dasel will join us lately. Our next contributor is Kat. So she holds a BSc in psychology, MSc organizational psychology, MSc occupation through health, postgraduate diploma in high intensity psychological therapies. She is currently working in IEPT service as a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist. She was working in mental health as an occupational therapist over 8 years. She is interested in Buddhism since a child. She has explored more when she moved to the UK for continue her university education. She is also a volunteer with a local scouts group.
Hi everyone, it's good to be here today.
Thank you, Kat, for joining us. So, our next contributor is Nivedita. Nivedita is the founder of ARTH, a mental health initiative that offers counseling and art based therapy services for people dealing with mental health issues. Her academic and professional training across over 25 years has focused on alleviating suffering through compassionate action. She is a trained occupational therapist from KEM Hospital and a psychiatric social worker with a doctorate from the Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai, where she also served as faculty. She has provided care in diverse mental health settings ranging from hospitals to rehabilitation centers and has worked in crisis areas such as suicide prevention and disaster relief, post earthquakes, and tsunamis. She has been actively involved in relief efforts during the pandemic with JSA, Jan Swastha Abhiyan, in resource mobilization, creation of a helpline, and training workshops. She facilitated 2 courses on applied Buddhist psychology in Mumbai and Chennai in partnership with BALM with an aim of bringing wisdom and compassion to our daily lives. She began studying Buddhism during her training with the WCCL Foundation, Pune, with Asha Pillai Balsara, and continues to pursue her studies in Buddhist philosophy from Tibet House, New Delhi, with Venerable Geshe Dorje Damdol. Thank you for joining us, Nivedita.
Thank you very much. Very, very grateful to be here. Thank you to the entire organizing team as well as our moderator for the day, and also, of course, immense gratitude to our teacher, without which we wouldn't be here.
Now, I think we have all the speakers and moderator here, so we hand over the program to Stacey.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody. I believe we're still waiting for Venerable Dasel to join us. So maybe while we wait, we can just check in. I'm curious, actually, where everybody is in the world. I am in Boston, right outside of Boston, Massachusetts, in the U.S., and it is 8:06 in the morning. So I had an early Sunday morning, and I'd love to hear where you are, Kat.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you've got a lot of energy in the morning. I tend to wake up quite late over the weekends, but here I'm in England. I'm in Manchester, so it's around 1, just after lunch on my side. And it just makes me think, oh, it's kind of like having food for thought, like lunchtime. Instead of eating something, I'm going to be having a good discussion that's going to feed my mind. So yeah, no, it's great to be here. And if anybody, ever pops by the side in Manchester, do give me a shout.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Dr. Nivedita, can we call you Nivi for short?
Works.
And where are you? Okay. Where are you in the world?
I'm from the land of the Sheikhs, currently based in Dubai. So it's a little after 4 p.m. here.
Okay.
And Kat, yes, 2 occupational therapists in the house. So it's lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's lovely to meet both of you. Yeah, I didn't realize that everybody's got different interesting backgrounds, because I tend to find that I'm the only occupational therapist in the room during discussions and things like that. So it's great to hear that Nivi's got some OT, who's an occupational therapist as well.
Yeah, amazing, extensive backgrounds for sure. So I wanted to just briefly start with a motivation. May this discussion have a positive effect on all beings who are participating in the discussion this morning, who are listening to the discussion this morning, and of course, all beings everywhere. So I feel it will be a fruitful discussion that we have, because I absolutely love this topic of impermanence and the certainty of change. So with that, we have, I think, a lot to discuss, which this series is a 2-part series. So I was hoping we could start with actually the explanation of the Buddha's suffering of change. What we regard as pleasure, due to its transitory nature, eventually turns into suffering. So in Buddhism, this is called the suffering of change. And I was hoping to actually direct this question first to Venerable Dasel, being our monastic in the house. But as we wait for her, does somebody want to jump in? Could you share your perspective or understanding on how the Buddha taught suffering of change?
Yeah, Stacey, I think that's a really good topic to start with, perhaps just reflecting on each of our understanding of suffering. And I'll be interested, Stacey, in what you think as well as what Nivi thinks too. But for me, I would say from my subjective sort of experience and understanding and reading the Buddhist scriptures as well, I've come to understand suffering as something or a situation when I don't have the ability or capacity or the resources to help me to adapt to the change. So to me, change itself, the definition of change and impermanence itself can be on a spectrum in terms of whether some people might see it as a form of suffering, some people might not see it as a form of suffering if they're only defining it with an emotional response. But for me, I like to see it just a little bit more than an emotional response, whether it makes you happy or sad. I think it's linked in to do with, whether we're able to adapt to that change or make that change into a situation that's going to help ourselves and others. And if we struggle to do that, then we might come up with some sort of uncomfortable emotions. But I think I'm aware, and do correct me as well, Stacey and Nivi, whether I think in Buddhist terms, suffering doesn't have to just mean having some negative emotions. It might mean just the concept itself change. Suffering means something that's not going to be permanent. So it's a little bit more broader than what we read in books. I don't know what you both think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful. The idea of talking about suffering as a difficulty with adapting to change as well. And yes, Stacey, I do agree. It would have been lovely to have that Venerable Dasel here. I think she's fabulous, and also she's been a teacher for a long time. When I think of suffering and specifically suffering of change, I'm not sure if the audience is completely fluent with all three forms of suffering. So I'm just going to slip into it, perhaps give a slightly more broader view.
Thank you.
I feel when most of us think of suffering, first of all, I feel there's, the term itself can be quite a heavy one. You hear the term suffering, and given this large push towards being positive, suffering tends to have a negative connotation, which I feel is a little misconstrued. And to really perhaps use a term like dukkha or maybe unease or dis-ease, many teachers have talked about using different labels so that we're able to go beyond the label to really understand the meaning of the term. Mm-hmm. Second is, when we think of dukkha or suffering, it's easy to understand it as the first version of suffering, which is suffering of suffering, saying, yeah, sure, I have a headache, I'm suffering, I've experienced loss. That's suffering. Those become more visible, more valid, in some way, more legitimate spaces of suffering. But really to broaden that understanding into looking at even pleasurable aspects, because what it does is it makes me grasp more. It makes me hold on a little bit tighter. When I get into a relationship and, it's all perfect in the beginning, it makes me want that to continue. And then, when that doesn't continue because things change and things are dependent on a whole host of other things, what eventually manifests is some amount of anger, some amount of annoyance, some amount of feeling betrayed, saying this wasn't what I signed up for. So I feel when we look at things which are pleasurable, it's impacted and influenced by the same change that is there so the good stuff and the bad stuff is all in constant change. But what happens is the way we tend to see it and what that makes us do, which is really hold on tighter, creates its own set of problems, because it is not going to stay the same. And what is then connecting back to what Kat said, our capacity to then adapt to all the shifts which are happening can contribute to considerable amount of suffering.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for that explanation. I agree wholeheartedly that we often misinterpret, suffering, the label suffering. And I do appreciate, applying different labels to it, because it does imply a very kind of negative connotation to it, almost like the opposite of what we're talking about, some permanent, understanding, like I'm never going to get beyond this state of heaviness, like emotional discomfort. And it comes at various levels, as you're saying. We have the more gross level of suffering that we all understand and see in old age, sickness, and death, and in our daily lives with like just very big changes, losing a family member, having a bad breakup, going through a divorce, things like that. And then like you have the more subtle level of change, as you referred to, Nibi, that it comes in the form of pleasure, so, I really want that, bowl of ice cream or another slice of chocolate cake, giving us this sense that, this is going to bring us happiness, like we want it. It brings us pleasure, and it's temporary pleasure, right? But in the Buddhist view, we're kind of looking at what the ultimate happiness is. How can we understand that what we are attaching to at that moment, or wanting, grasping at, okay, I want this, and understanding it intellectually from that it's a very temporary pleasure, and applying the understanding of that and everything, even, engaging in new relationships, that good energetic vibration we get when we meet somebody and we're like, yes, this is the one. We tend to apply, oh yes, I'm going to be happy forever with this person forever, but we know intellectually, if we look at the big view, we understand reality as it is. We see things. We've understand that we've broken up with people in the past. It may also happen again in the future, but applying that understanding of, oh, in this time now, this is bringing me pleasure. And in the future, I don't know what will happen, but I can be certain that things will change. And this is the certainty of change. So that kind of begs, well, another question of, how can we begin to live our daily lives with this understanding and mindful understanding that the second piece of chocolate cake or the new girlfriend or boyfriend or whomever isn't going to bring me ultimate happiness? So how do we begin to loosen the grasping at this almost wanting desire that it is a permanent ultimate happiness? So that, I think, is kind of the thread that runs through a lot of this discussion of the certainty of change. And it's so beautiful, because I think once we begin to touch deeper on it, we can really begin to live joyful, mindful, in the moment, lives, right? I think that's kind of the essence of what we're talking about here. And I'm hoping we can touch upon it more and more as we go through the question list. So I'm going to ask Sherab or Ray, whoever is in charge of the PowerPoint presentation, to maybe give us the question number 3, if you don't mind, because I feel like we did a good job in reviewing the first 2. So the third question is, how can reflecting on impermanence and change help us to see with greater clarity how attachment and aversion arise in the mind? So I believe we've already started talking about this. Who would like, Kat, do you want to give your perspective on this question?
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. I think you summarized so well to help us recognize that we can look at suffering in different ways. And I really like how you mentioned that we can find, because I before never even thought that when there's pleasure, there can still be suffering. So how you mentioned, actually, we tend to forget that it's impermanent. We tend to think that it's going to last forever. That's something that does help us kind of look into what we can do in practice. It sounds like people know, we might be aware, we know that things are going to change, but in that moment of time, our brain just forgets.
Yes.
And feels very permanent, not just with love, but with pain as well. You feel like it's going to last forever.
Yes.
So what I tend to suggest, coming from my background as being a cognitive behavioral therapist as well, is that acknowledging, just even doing something to recognize when we are thinking this is permanent, because often we don't know that we think that it's permanent until like 2 hours later. So that does take a bit of practice. And I'm sure, Tenzin and Nivedita can talk a little bit more about the Buddhist way of, mindfulness, how to switch our attention to the present. But for me, I think it's something to recognize that, when we're attaching on this impermanence idea is to, I know this sounds like it's not rocket science, but it isn't, just to write it down. So everybody has different ways of working. You might be talking to somebody, but for me, it's more self-reflection. So writing things down on a piece of paper, getting those thoughts out, and asking what I would call Socratic questions. I don't know if anybody's heard of those before, like the phrase Socratic questions. Yeah, based on Socrates, a philosopher who asked a lot of life questions. And so you might ask, would I make the same decisions? Would I still do the same thing if I knew that's going to change in 3 days time, 5 days time, what else would I be doing? I mean, that's just a start, to get the conversation going in terms of what I would do to help my brain to remember that things aren't permanent, is to start asking myself questions or even writing things down. I don't know what you both might think about that.
Absolutely. I think any approach to help remind ourselves of it, because I think there is this, meditation is this process of refamiliarizing ourselves, with, even if we're sitting and watching the breath, even, or watching our, our body, going through scanning our body and trying to get us, our bodies to relax, our minds to relax, and watching the thoughts rise and dissolve and rise and dissolve. There's that act of refamiliarizing yourself with that process and bringing yourself more in the moment. So I think any approach that helps us to do that is going to be a beneficial one. So if it's writing it down, I've had, like, whenever I'm working through a difficult issue, I will write things down. I'll have, I have an altar. I do my practice in the morning, at night, and I try to make, notes. I'll write it down, put like little reminders or inspirational quotes or things like that. But also, like you said, reflecting on on asking yourself questions. Would I make this choice? Would I do this in, a few days' time? Or even like, I tend to go, I don't know if I will be alive later today or tomorrow, because the time, death is certain. The time of death is uncertain. So even allowing slowly, I know it can be uncomfortable for folks to, work with that reality, but I think it can be incredibly powerful and help to put things into perspective as well when making decisions or beginning to understand where, you are at that moment in time. But anyway, what do you think, Dr. Nivedita?
So a couple of things. One is, when we're talking about impermanence, and second is we're speaking about attachment or aversion, which comes up. I want us to, in some ways, just separate the two for a moment, because both of these are, I feel, habits which really require a lot of reflection, like what you both have been sharing in terms of, and reflection could be in a whole host of ways. It could be conversations with Sangha members, it could be contemplation exercises, it could be being reflective, it could be writing. But I feel one is being able to understand and get a sense of impermanence and the fact that there is constant change which is happening. Second is perhaps to also start recognizing that even though there is change all the time, we don't necessarily see it. Because in some ways, we've solidified our sense of self, we've solidified our body, we've solidified the other, we've solidified the world around us, which is why we don't really also, it prevents us from accessing or just seeing this constant space of change. I mean, in all honesty, if I just pull the skin on top of my hand, it takes a little longer than it used to kind of go back, because it's losing its elasticity. I don't see this on a daily basis, but it's happening. So one is I don't see it, and second is because I have a tendency to solidify everything and see things as being permanent in some way. I then tend to have great attachment or aversion, because there is a thing that the real I is really wanting to hold on to. So I feel both of these can be worked upon separately as well. One is the more we are able to really see impermanence, to whatever extent. I mean, we may not have the wisdom or the merit of many enlightened beings, but we can move in that direction. What the Buddha said was, if we work on what we believe and we've examined his teachings to feel true and to know that they're true, then we can work on this path to start understanding impermanence as it is, which means between where reality is versus what I see, this gap, I just become aware of, there's a gap. I don't see things as they are. And that itself, I feel, is hugely liberating. But, it requires a certain amount of both honesty and compassion to be able to say, I'm not there yet.
Yes.
And it's okay to say I'm not there yet, but it's critical to know that you're not there yet. Because otherwise, we're there saying, oh, yeah, I see it all. I understand impermanence. This talk started at 4 and it's going to end at 5:30. There's impermanence for you, right?
Right.
Or, we didn't know each other and now we in some way do. Impermanence. So the notion of impermanence, and especially gross impermanence, what gets referred to as gross impermanence, is a very easy concept to understand. All of us see it. Like if you have a cup of tea that you like to drink at a particular temperature, you're going to be very, very particular as you hold that cup to make sure you drink it within that little window of time, because the temperature will drop. But what we tend to forget is it's not just the tea that's getting cold. The skin is getting older. We're in some ways spending time doing things. And in that, we are changing. The things are changing and nothing is as it seems. But if we start seeing that, that's when I feel we also break past the solidity that we've imposed on who I am, on who you are, how I think you are, and all of these different layers. And then we're able to kind of work through our attachment and aversion, because really, what is it that you are attached or averse to?
Yeah, absolutely. The grasping at this solidified I is right, the root of all of our misconceptions or delusions. And yeah, that's a really important point, and one that needs a whole other topic of discussion too, right? Which I think we can, focus a lot on that in our part 2, because I think, yes, that really helps us know where the root causes lie. So that's, and we need to work on that as much as we possibly can, because that's what is going to enable us to create the space that we need, like you said, to begin to see and understand our attachments and our aversions, what we're grasping at, what we want. Yes, I want that, and then what? Oh, I don't want that. So how do we, begin to approach the middle way? How do we, and that really is incredibly important for us to begin to even identify that that's attachment and that's aversion. And
if I may add something, when you connect this back with what your earlier question was about the suffering of change, really our attachment and aversion is pretty much in that domain to a large extent. So as we work on our understanding of suffering of change and impermanence there, it really helps to not be as attached or as averse. We're able to, even while perhaps the feelings don't disappear as quickly as we would like them to go, we're not holding on to that as tightly, which itself can be quite, a little bit of space to breathe.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that we're aware that in the gross matter things change, but then when it comes to our identity and ourself, it's a little hard to detect that impermanence, that change. And what I'm hearing is we know things change, but at the same time we don't want it to change. Is that what you're saying, in terms of sometimes when you talk about that grasping, are we sort of suggesting that in general human beings we kind of know that things change, but there's something inherent in us, as Stacey was saying, something deeper inside of us that actually still continues to, even though we know the nature of things don't change, things change, that we don't, some parts of it we don't want it to change, and that's when it becomes a problem. Is that what you're suggesting, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Right. That's with the things we want and the things that we don't want, because we could say, oh, that person causes me so much aversion. We all have we've all had experiences with difficult people in our lives, right? That's not a far-fetched situation. So, it arises with attachments, the wanting of something and then the not wanting of something, right? So, but I think what Nivi said before was really important, and what I was also reflecting on this morning when I thought about, okay, the certainty of change, I love it so much. When you like really meditate on it, it's just, it could bring you a lot of happiness, actually, in reality. But when you're working on it in daily life, it's incredibly difficult. But this applies, I think, with everything that we're working on in our lives to transform. Is this idea of self-acceptance with that? Well, let's just start with this, because it's a couple different concepts there. But being honest with yourself, being honest with yourself, I find, is the most important thing to reflect on at first, because you really need to be able to identify the feelings of, oh, I want this, I don't want that. And if you're kind of ignoring it or pretending, because we do a lot of work, I think, in general, of not work. It's kind of a natural, I think, unfortunate thing where we pretend a lot that, oh, that's not the case, or I don't really, and I think it's incredibly important for us to begin to be honest with ourselves. Oh, yes, I do have that strong feeling every time I see that person, or I really do want that, new person in my life, or this or that. But how do we begin to work with those almost obsessive or, emotions that create that energy of wanting, grasping, and then, or pushing away. So I don't know if we want to talk more about how that, I don't know if you want to talk more about that, Doctor.
Yeah, maybe a specific example might be helpful in terms of that wanting and grasping, especially, with the pandemic. I think anxiety, being really nervous is going to be quite a common presentation where we want to, we might have constant grasping in terms of, for example, wanting to know more, about the COVID, or wanting to overprotect yourself, or do things that you want to protect yourself and other people, like keeping a lot of space, distance, a lot of cleaning, all of that. How do we know when that's doing too much? And then avoiding, not call it. For some people, they might even not want to talk about COVID or call the doctor when they have symptoms or this and that. I think what I'm trying to sort of make sense here is that when we're perhaps in a state of uncertainty, is that we try to make things certain for ourselves by either grasping onto something or avoiding on. Ooh, welcome. We've got Venerable Tenzin joining us.
Yes, hello. That's nice impermanence right there. That's total impermanence, working with a laptop, a 7-year-old laptop. It will give you impermanence all the time.
Wow. Well, welcome. I'm glad you could join us.
Well, that's like joyful perseverance, never giving up. So that's practice in action for me every time, is dealing with the computer world. Anyway, wonderful. Nice to see you this morning, and I hope your conversation's been going on. Sorry to just drop into the middle of it.
That's okay. We've gone through quite a few questions so far, and I think we're really getting to, the heart of the matter. We've talked a lot about, we had a nice explanation by Dr. Nivedita about, the suffering of change, and, the 3 types of suffering from the Buddhist perspective. And we started discussing how reflecting on impermanence can help us see with greater clarity how attachment and aversion arise in the mind. So we were just discussing we kind of got to this point where how we can begin to work with it in our daily lives, and begin to kind of identify when the feeling of grasping at something, of wanting arises in the mind, or pushing away. So just beginning to identify that. And that raised a few questions concerning, it's really important to recognize it and be honest with yourself, what is arising, so you can begin to work with whatever it is that's causing any discomfort, dissatisfaction, or whatever. So we're just discussing that. Kat was trying to bring in a specific example that would bring us, more into I think a better understanding of how grasping and aversion works. And I'm sorry, Kat, if you want to try to recap what you were saying concerning COVID and all of the stuff that came up for each of us, I'm sure, on that level of.
Yeah, so thanks, Stacey. I think I was just trying to make sense of it myself in terms of how we might be grasping or, sort of avoiding as a response to uncertainty or change. And having COVID or the situation of the pandemic of COVID brings a lot of uncertainty, especially early times when we don't know the prognosis or things, what's going to happen when you have it, or how can we catch it. And I think when times of uncertainty, we might want to make things certain for ourselves, which isn't wrong. I think in some ways, you're not here to judge that, but it's very common to see that when we try to make things certain, or when we try to grasp onto a particular idea, we can see two different types of behaviors. One is we might put a lot more energy into something. We might overcheck something, overseek reassurance, spend too much time worrying. And then on the other end of the spectrum is when we might avoid, because it's so scary, the topic, we just want to turn off the TV. And I'm not saying what's right or not wrong. It's more about what's appropriate to that person, that's helpful to that person. But I think sometimes it's helpful to reflect on these kind of behaviors to know whether we're continuing to actually, are we still being honest with ourselves? Stacey, as you mentioned, one of the ways to tackle impermanence and to appreciate it is to be honest with ourselves and to recognize, are we feeding into that suffering? And I was wondering, sometimes if we're stuck into doing these kind of behaviors, as you said, we're adverse to some things and not, is that actually helping us be honest and recognize and help our brain remember that things are going to change?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a question that I asked myself in terms of, when we were talking about the topic, how to help our brain remember that things are impermanent, because often we don't remember until hours later or, days later, where in that moment of time, we're convinced things are permanent for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Venerable Dasel, do you have any insights that you want to share or concerns?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think with the whole topic of impermanence, I mean, this really often is what is the cause of suffering in the Buddhist framework and in our own experience. But I think what we need to remember about impermanence is it's a glorious opportunity for awakening as well. So without change, we don't have growth. And without a sense of humor, we get a lot of frustration. So I'll share that as just this momentary. I wasn't suffering, but I thought back to 10 years ago or 20 years ago in my younger life, I would have been like, if I had a meeting or something that I was late for, or the equipment didn't work or something was going on where I just wasn't in control, my mind would have been flipping out. And now with practice and with awareness, it's kind of like I was laughing through it. I'm like, well, my 7-year-old laptop's not really working. Sherab's calling me. If I answer the phone, I'm not going to be able to really put time to getting online where I want to be, but I don't want to be rude, so I'll answer the phone. It's like kind of with awareness, letting everything kind of appear and progress in ways where your mind is expansive enough to accept that things aren't always going to go the way you've planned them, to have humility to say some things are more important to focus on rather than the things that we think we have to do, and not to let the mind get caught up in some kind of a feedback loop around grasping at it should be this way, I should be able to control it. And to remember that change in every momentary way, whether it's through our mental cognizance or our physical conditioning, is a natural part of life. That's not something we're here to try to control or to try to overly direct. In the Buddhist practice, it's much more about cultivating awareness of the state of mind. And that awareness is constantly capable, as it's growing, to handle any kind of obstacles, we can say, in the Buddhist practice, or just situations. I don't even know if we need to label them all the time as obstacles or things like this. But the awareness, as that Kat was saying, about staying aware of what's arising in that moment, whether it's in the psychology of the mind, habits, or of feeling expressions in the body, changes, whether they're pleasurable or painful. The Buddha kind of laid these kind of parameters out for us very nicely, the 8 worldly concerns. So typically, if we look at this kind of a pair of 4 dyads that travel together, of pleasure and pain, loss and gain, praise and blame, and fame and shame. If people say things negatively about us, we feel shame. Those are kind of the dyads of extreme swinging that affect both our body and our mental states. And he kind of said, you've got to know those extremes and then go right down the middle. That's the middle path, is not being caught by those kind of conditions and conditioning that we've ourselves played into, which has us grasping at pleasure and aversion to pain, grasping at gain. We want the gain, we don't want loss, wanting fame, not wanting shame, and wanting to hear praise and not being able to hear any kind of criticism. By their own, there's nothing wrong with any of those 8. What's difficult is when our mind is creating habits that are always going in one direction or the other. I mean, pain is there to teach us lessons about healing. If our mind didn't become aware of physical pain, we would really be in trouble, because we wouldn't do anything to like alleviate hunger when we felt hunger pains, or get a drink of water when we felt thirsty, or if we sprained our foot, like get some medicine for it. So pain in and of itself isn't a bad thing, just like emotional pain, like heartbreak when we lose somebody that we love, or we ourselves lose our health. We feel sometimes emotional pain around even suffering the physical, but there's nothing wrong with those experiences. Actually, in my own life, I've learned so much more from difficult circumstances of change that I didn't see coming. And so I think this kind of impermanence, we've got to see there's a kind of unwantedness about the change, but yet there's a kind of glorious opportunity that's held within the change as well. So it's a natural part of life. Just like COVID showed us, death is a natural part of life. The human body isn't going to live forever. And the fear that came up around COVID was the opportunity to look at how comfortable we really have accepted the fact that we're in a very impermanent kind of appearance in this lifetime. It's not going to last forever. And that makes it much more precious. That makes it much more valuable. Instead of reacting with doubt and uncertainty and overly trying to control this experience, it may just open us up much more to those edges of fear, those edges of doubt, which are really the edges of growth. So anyway, I don't know if that's weaving into anything you've talked about, but that's what
I think you did an excellent summary of what it is. You said very concisely.
Not knowing what you had said, that's just what I wanted to share to what came to mind.
Well, that's amazing, because you definitely managed to touch upon many topics that we could probably spend many series dissecting and unfolding, particularly the 8 worldly concerns. I've used that framework in my life for a very long time, and it's helped greatly to be able to mindfully see where I am at that moment. Like, oh, I see, I'm not accepting this criticism right now. I really only enjoy all of the nice things that people say about me. But really, like what you were saying before, is like that edge, or that, dissatisfaction, that suffering, that whatever is arising in our bodies and minds at that moment that cause us to, not experience pleasure, but, it brings us to that edge of growth. I love that, because when things change on many different levels, the gross level, the subtle level, etc., but when we begin to see it and feel it, and, see ourselves having aversion to it, that is the time when we really need to dig in and start asking the questions like Kat was saying, and begin to do the meditations on analyzing, where is this I, this existent I that feels so solid and real, and etc., and begin to apply all the various methods that we learn in our sanghas or communities or in our Buddhist practices, to begin to give ourselves the space that we need to see that there is great positivity and growth in those periods of difficult change, because that's what brings us, that's the beauty of living. I mean, it's hard to be human, right?
It's hard and it's glorious. The Buddha said it's the most precious rebirth that you can take. So, finding the gloriousness as often as possible is great. Like living in the Tibetan diaspora and community in the Himalayan, what I've noticed is they don't really have a lot of disturbance, the Tibetans, about being in refugee status, the ones that came out, or the Himalayan nuns that are living without heat high up in the 13, 14,000 feet altitude. And what they say is, oh, a rainbow, look, how wonderful, how auspicious. Oh, pouring rain, how wonderful, how auspicious. Oh, snow is coming down, it's so beautiful, how auspicious. They just work with everything. And even like using something as neutral and benign as weather, is really helpful. Sometimes our own emotions are a little too difficult to hone in so much, but remembering impermanence on something very like benign, like weather. I mean, I'm here back in New England, where I'm from in the US, and people often just talk about weather because it's a very nice way to connect with your neighbors. You're not talking politics, you're not talking religion, you're not talking gossiping, and you're like, oh, it's a lovely day today. Or, oh, I feel the chill coming in the falls. It's like a way to connect, but it's also noting that things are changing. The seasons are very obvious here.
Exactly.
So
and like
we can also do that.
Yeah, like looking in nature.
Looking outside that.
It's our
Everybody's,
mirror. It's a reflection of who we are in this world. It's constantly changing and dying and coming into being. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I just think it's a natural evolution. And, COVID brought a lot of fear to the surface, and it made it very personal for all of us. And that way it was really also glorious because it didn't leave anyone out. I mean, I'm not saying it was a good thing about the situation. Nobody wanted that. And that's also another truth. Nobody wants suffering. Everyone wants happiness. So that also proves kind of our yearning for changing conditions that are not comfortable into more favorable ones. That's a human desire. That's a really living desire. I mean, plants like having a good environment to grow in. Fishes do, birds do, animals do. Hey, guess what? All humans do too. So COVID showed us that. And I think we also saw in a big way the shared collective fear that humanity kind of meets these moments with, of like how precious all of our human lives are. We don't want any of our families, our friends, our strangers, our neutral ones. We don't want anyone to get that. So we can meet that situation as well as kind of that edge of growing into our awareness, growing and meeting our fear of our mortality, and then using that awareness of our mortality to really make this life meaningful.
Yeah.
In that sense, we could really trivialize so many things that disturb our minds on a day-to-day basis around, silly things that we say, oh, well, what a big attachment that like morning cup of latte is, I've got to have it just with this kind of oat milk and soy milk or whatever kind of like particularities, and just say, how wonderful it is to wake up. I didn't die in my sleep last night, and start with that mindset.
Yeah.
So it's got these bigger opportunities that we can use the humor as well. As Jetsuma, one of my beloved teachers, says, the sense of humor should be the seventh perfection. And that helps us meet this kind of impermanence and uncertainty with more joy and with more kind of a warm heart.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. The sense of humor. Gosh, so important. Boy, we can create series for, to talk about all these topics forever. It's amazing.
That's what I love about the Dharma. It's an endless well of a font of goodness and wisdom and compassion and love and joy. So that's, this vessel is so precious, the Dharma itself. I often say that to my teacher now, who's 85. whom I met 22 years ago. And I say, Rinpoche, it's so wonderful because, yes, it's like peeling sometimes the layers of the onion. But at some point, there's no more onion, but there's just this glorious, like maybe you've made a soup. You've just used those layers and as ingredients into this beautiful soup. And then the Dharma is just delicious. You can keep then tasting and going back to it and remembering, oh, yes, I was able to get through the tears of the onions, but that was just one part of the ingredients in my beautiful Dharma recipe.
Yeah, it's like
And
the
share
essence.
it with the others as well.
Sorry?
And share it with the others as well.
Oh, definitely. It automatically is being shared, no matter we're aware of it or not. So if we're more consciously being aware, sharing that goodness and that yumminess of the practice of Dharma, all the better.
Yeah, it's really like, yeah, bringing the essence of it into everything that we do. Yeah, that's, I think, total integration, the essence of it just pervading. So I think that we are going to maybe eventually get to questions soon, but I was hoping that before we get to questions, maybe we could just kind of give our listeners some practical methods, maybe to begin to work with being able to mindfully see when these aversions and attachments arise in the mind so that we can
I think
space.
Stacey, that's a really good point I wanted to ask, because I really like how Venerable Tenzin Dasel was having such a might say positive or really a sunny approach to things, even though it might appear, it's rain for some people, like, oh my goodness, she's always able to find a different positive and humorous way to respond. And I find that actually to be quite a skill. And humor is quite a skill to have. And I was wondering if, Venerable or any of you two have any tips or techniques that can help us sort of let go of some of those habits where even myself have a tendency to see the worst of things because I want to prevent that from happening, to shifting more to having those different perspectives in that moment of time. Because I might think about it 2 hours later, like, oh, I should have thought about this another way. But how can we have that kind of in the moment sense of joy? Is there any way to help us develop or cultivate that kind of attitude?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Kat. Dr. Nivedita, would you like to respond?
Sure. So first of all, so glad Dasela is here, because really, I mean, what she was describing right now is not just the teaching, but also really applying it when the laptop doesn't work. And in some ways, it's really that simple. Okay, laptop is not working, and all of us can imagine this, which starts building up, right? And when it builds up, then by default, oh my God, there's a call coming, and oh, this is happening, and everything becomes much bigger than really what it is. And instead, if you're able to say, oh, yes, of course, it's not working, because why would it? Because that would mean things would work.
Right.
You can kind of just smile it off and say, yeah, it's not working. And at the same time, what was really precious was, despite it not working, the notion of joy is perseverance and saying, I'm still going to try. And I'm still going to do what I need to do, because you don't abandon that just because everything is changing anyway. So what's the point? But really saying everything is changing. Therefore, there's perhaps a chance I can still join in, even if it's 20 minutes later, and I can still do what is necessary. And I think that's incredibly precious. And if we can bring those little elements into our life, one is just being able to catch the mind. And, like what Kat said, sometimes it's only 2 days later that you realize, oh, maybe I needn't have lost it completely. I feel that's still good, because you now know. And if it took you 2 days, maybe the next time it doesn't take you as long. And sometimes I feel, we're just in the thick of these 8 worldly concerns, running so fast and furious between these 4 and 4, that sometimes I feel we don't get to hit pause. So I feel this, perhaps if we can just have small elements of, I'm just going to sit and watch me do the things I do, instead of just doing and diving into that river of everything that's going on around us and within us. Can I just step back? Okay. So it could be, the tiniest of practices that we set up, just to say, I'm going to step away to start with. And then, of course, slowly build our capacity, because I don't know when we get there, but wherever we get. But in the meantime, it becomes easier to just sit and say, okay, maybe I needn't have. And sometimes you'll discover that you don't need 48 hours for that little light to go on, and maybe it's happening in 24 hours. And sometimes, if you're really brave enough, I mean, this was something I used to do with my daughter all the time. When you get really in the thick of things, we would just hit this pause and say, I'm going to do take 2 or a do-over, and it just eased the stress, because I was like, maybe and in take 2, I could be more dramatic and hysterical as a mom, saying, how can you do this? In which case she's probably going to laugh at my face, which works out well, So I think just the smallest of ways to say, how do I ease up when, just not take myself that seriously, because that becomes, I feel, part of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful. I love that. Take 2. Yep. Perfect. How are
very
we
beautiful. Can I add just 2 thoughts in there? Just wanted to share, validating what Kat said, because even 2 hours later, that's great. You've learned something. Your awareness is expanded, and sometimes when emotion arises, or when, for me, like my little sign is really an embodied sense of tightness, or my breath, if I've lost my breath, and that kind of tells me, oh, you're starting to lose a bit of your equanimity and your present moment peace of mind. So I use that knowing of like a feeling of contraction to just be using that to be aware and take a breath. So you can use that sense of frustration that starts to arise to check the mind, to keep it really expanded, and bring those 4 immeasurable qualities to yourself first, of loving kindness, compassion, joy, equanimity. And the 2-minute timeout rule of just taking 2 minutes in that first moment of awareness of frustration really creates much more open possibility. So for me, like, I'll use this example, just this easy example of this morning. I had the laptop charged. I had I had 2 phones ready, because I have one for Indian number, one for US, and people call different lines. I was like, oh, maybe there will be a reason for those. I'll bring them with me downstairs. I've been really just aware of just doing a lot of movement and a ton of travel these days. So I'm being really easy with myself of like, you've got to just do the best you can, and you'll show up with everything you have to bring, but it may not be in the moment or the way, you're even planning for it or trying to be organized. So just that awareness of like, life is going to throw us curves. And in our Dharma practice, it tends to come like, the further stronger our dedication motivation is that we're practicing, the pure motivation, more obstacles arise. We go, oh, good. Now it's getting really good. Mara's getting nervous, like when Siddhartha, before he got his enlightenment, when he was getting really strong in his meditation under the Bodhi tree, that's when Mara, the worldly kind of illusory temptations were sent for him, like the beautiful daughters that were actually demonesses, the warring sons that were actually aggressive, that he put the hand up and turned them to flowers. So there's a lot within the teaching of, these kinds of habits that we have taking us off track. But as long as we remind ourselves 2 days later, 2 weeks later, 2 hours later, that we saw that's the next time going to reduce the amount of time we need until we get so skillful, we'll catch that right as it's starting to just arise, that we can bring that laughter and that ease to it. So that definitely gets better and easier over time, I found in my practice. And the second point is, yes, just allowing the difficulties to be difficult. I mean, sometimes they just are, and just to acknowledge like, oh, but am I the only one? I'm not the only one that has technical difficulties with the computers. And as Sister was saying, the precious idea of, just allowing in that moment awareness to say, now I need a little just 2-minute timeout. Like, let's both take a break. That's what I did. Like the first time Sherab called, I'm like, I know he wants me to say, yes, I'm still on as part of the group, but now I'm going to just make the choice to try to stay with the problem, stay with the challenge, find the resolution. Yes, I'm using the phone. That was a good idea. I had come upon that there's other options when we have space for that, when we have peace of mind and clarity, then those options can come much more easily to the surface. So this is really also working with that momentary, when we're a little off balance, helping ourselves find the balance first, coming back to the breath, letting that create the opportunity and possibility. There was one other thing, but it's not there now, so I'll just leave it at that.
So I guess when we are in the midst of a difficult situation, maybe let's just say, either depressed, suffering in some way, how can we begin to, how can we apply this concept of impermanence and the certainty of change in those moments? Because we've all been through difficult times when things have changed. And what's only arising for us are these, heavy emotions, and we're having a hard time, like, finding, that like glimmer of hope, or looking at the sky. Everything, all the clouds seem a little bit dark. We've had those days, we've had those weeks. Sometimes, it stretches into months at a time. It really depends on the situation, of course, the level. So I guess, can we share with our listeners what types of, we've been saying many different things, but like, how could we kind of concretely provide them with some, maybe 3 or 4 top, go-tos that could provide them with finding a glimmer of positivity in the mind, or being able to relax the body enough to create some space to begin to see that, oh, this is not a permanent situation, that things are changing, that there is, there's some hope there. So how do we, who would like to kind of speak to that, just to share maybe a few methods? I don't know.
I mean, I'd like to just start and then open it up just from a Buddhist perspective. If we really make it about I and the ego, then the ego is just happy to be miserable, because you're still feeding the ego. So the more you make anything about I and me, that especially if you're really having difficulties, sufferings, depressions, the more you're aware of that and thinking about just that, you're going totally away from what the Buddha's wonderful revelatory expression of enlightenment was, which is a selflessness. So the more we turn inward, the more we can even exacerbate that heaviness and that those conditions of mind that don't benefit oneself and they don't bring benefit to others. The more we keep a very selfless frame of mind to the wanting to be of benefit to all others, when those situations arise, like let's say a benign thing like this morning, having technical difficulties, as Jetsuma would say, like, if that's the biggest problem I have in my life, well, that's pretty good, right? So in moments like that of just momentary inconvenience, and like really there were some problems there, but a great teaching is, if there's a problem and a solution, there's no need to worry. And if there's a problem and no solution, there's no point to worry. So there's really no problem. So if we have little tiny challenges that we let overwhelm us, we're creating mountains out of molehills. But if we see them in the broader perspective of, like, no one's life is on the line here. If this is the biggest problem and challenge I'm facing right now, it's really not that bad. To then the bigger, deeper problems of, losing someone we love, or getting information, getting bad medical information that we didn't see coming about ourselves. In those moments of kind of bigger, shocking, unexpected news, let's say, we can remember also that in this moment, there's nothing that we can really do to change the situation. We're not the only ones to have ever experienced that situation. And we can bring incredible compassion in that moment, both to oneself and to all others who are in that very time, or who have ever been in that same situation. We can make it a collective, and not just about a me, but about a we. Oh, all of us would never want this news. No one wants to lose their precious human life or lose their precious family members or precious friends. You know, no one wants the earth to be undergoing the climate change, those bigger problems, macro situations where we might experience first as the micro, like we've lost someone who's really precious to us suddenly. Their life has been taken. Then, of course, we can feel those emotions, and we should really feel a sadness there. There's nothing wrong with feeling the sadness, but we don't suffer from feeling that sadness. Instead, we say, oh, I'm feeling the sadness because I really loved deeply that connection. That relationship was really precious. And we can value that preciousness and say, well, all people have relationships, no matter what you think of them politically or socially, or I don't know, however we judge people. Everybody has relationships and precious ones in their lives that they wouldn't want to lose. So in that sense, we're all the same. And so we drop right down into that shared humanity, that oneness, on that, and we can then use that experience from our own loss and our own suffering to expand out into a great, we say, ninje chenpo, huge compassion for everything that is. And we drop the labels that often create more suffering, you know, when we create the divisions. So from the little moments we say, oh, if that's the worst thing that's going to happen today, that's not so bad, to the biggest moments of really loss of things that can't be changed, like when someone really passes away. You know, if we're really sad, that's okay. But that sadness, we remind ourselves not to get depressed, not to feel hopeless. The sadness is a mirror for how much love we had and how much connection. And then we just send them on and say, thank you so much for teaching me about love and about interconnection. And I'm not going to mourn that I don't have you anymore. I'm going to celebrate that we had that time with each other. And that just expands again, bigger and bigger out into the appreciation. So, you know, even with something like climate change, of course, we all benefit from having healthy, balanced nature and respect for our little minuscule part of making that happen. But we don't create tension around forcing and judging others and making enemies. We try to come to creative solutions that individually we can make and that we can then share with others as teachers or as parts of community, and make it much more about a creative expression of change that we actually are contributing to. Whether we're completely and totally effective or not, who knows, but we do our best and we teach others to celebrate and bring their best, and then we collectively make that and really make it much more process oriented instead of like, oh, we're not going to get that endpoint. Oh, we're not going to hit that goal. That's too much pressure for any one person. It's way too much pressure for any one generation. I mean, we've got to take a much longer view. So anyway, just to start with the Buddhist kind of idea, the Buddha said, you know, yes, we'll all attain enlightenment, but 3 countless eons. You know, once I heard that phrase, I said to my teacher, what is a countless eon? Like, he said, oh, it's just a very long time. Meaning once you start practicing on the Bodhisattva path, which is being here for the benefit of all mother sentient beings, you know, you're just in it. Like Jetsuma would say, 24/7, the Bodhisattva doesn't take time out, you know. So it's kind of your dedication, but it's not with a pressure. It's not with a fear. It's not like putting yourself in a vice, which is just really not healthy for us, but finding the practical momentary spaciousness as things become a little bit challenging to, you know, think, well, if here's a problem, if there's a solution, that will be great. I'll find it. And if there's no solution, then I'll accept it with peace because I've tried to find the solution, but sometimes there's no solution. I mean, you know, change and death, our mortality is a natural part of life, is a natural part of immortality, because without mortality, nothing could flow, nothing could be learned on the individual and the collective level. So we have to see things with a much more holistic, like long vision view. And this in terms of the Nalanda tradition of Vajrayana Buddhism, this is a very wonderful psychological Buddhist perspective that's really lacking in the West. You know, we don't talk much about death at all in Western psychology. And many times we are looking back like, oh, it was my mother's fault. Oh, it was my family's fault. You know, we're looking to past situations that aren't even there anymore. So I think we need to look realistically in the moment. If we can change something, we will, into the better, into transforming it into where we hope to go. If we can't, we have to accept things like, when someone dies, well, if I wasn't as skillful in that relationship, let me use this knowledge now, how quickly people could disappear from my life, to make really precious, wonderful connections with all mother beings, with friends, with those who label enemies, with strangers. Get rid of those labels. Just be there for others. Because things will change. But if we train the mind, what won't change is that stability, that beautiful bodhicitta of the awakening mind that wishes for all beings to have happiness and not to suffer. Everything else we can expect to change around us. That's the nature of the impermanent, compounded world, of plants and trees, of planets, of people. The material is always going to change. But if we train the mind in a very clear, awakening consciousness, that is always going to serve us. That will change all the way up to Buddhahood. The Buddha himself said that. So this, in a Buddhist framework, is the wonderful way that we use these obstacles. We use this impermanence to form the diamond mind. Vajra means like a diamond that is unbreakable, unshakable. Someone like His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, he shows us this. He's been through so much incredible impermanence, lost everything of his potala, his home, that all the fifth Dalai Lama on upwards had been living and growing the Dharma practice within the tradition there. But he didn't fight. He moved on from that to become a great world leader, and he shows us from the strength. And here I'm not talking mind of brain. I'm really talking here, our mind that's feeling, that's knowing from a deep, deep intuitive place, which I think really is a very precious cultivation of a subtle awareness that we then bring into the conscious awareness through the intellect, sometimes through feelings, through just even deeper knowing. Some of you are mothers, so my mother had a great mother's intuition. I used to say her mother's antennae stretched more than halfway around the world, So we have many awarenesses on many levels of mind that can always help us, no matter how many things are changing in the external world, in the material world, in the feeling, emotional world. This deeper level of mind is what we're really, really using everything as our practice to cultivate.
I really like how Venerable Tenzin Dasel was saying, especially, when what you've come across to me is that when someone's feeling down, depressed, or have these difficult emotions, immediately I don't hear any judgmental concepts. It sounds very helpful when you say, oh, that must mean that you're connecting with somebody, that you care about somebody, that's why you're feeling sad. And it might seem quite natural for people to think that, but sometimes I think for a lot of people that might not be an automatic thought. When they're feeling sad or angry or annoyed or irritable, they might automatically judge themselves. And what I'm hearing from you is that there's a lot of self-compassion when it comes to managing these changes, is to be able to, first of all, even accept or allow oneself to have that kindness and differentiate it from being selfish, which I think takes a bit of time to separate. And the second point, which you've mentioned, is something that I've used in therapy as well to work with people with depression, is to follow your wisdom, follow your plan, and not your mood. So when you mentioned about having an aspiration, focusing on the bigger picture of things, that's a really practical and helpful approach. I find, especially for those who are quite low in their mood, they get so stuck into their emotions that they forget and don't remember what their goals are or what's important to them sometimes. I know it's important for them to not feel that way, or to, not lose somebody that they had before. But just that point you said, the aspiration for helping other people already, is a really positive thing, and something that we encourage in therapy, for getting them to help find out what's important to them and try and do what's important to them regardless of the changes in situation. Like what you're doing, it's important for you to join our conversation today, so you adapted and did what you can regardless of how you were probably feeling. You still kind of followed your wisdom or your plan, and consequently can see that you've already shared a lot of joy with us as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. The thing I want to mention about therapy in Buddhism and depression is that Buddhism is not really a good, it's not meant as a template in those certain situations, because there's a certain healthiness of the mind that has to be there to want to do the bodhisattva, play the role of the bodhisattva, live the bodhicitta, which really means you've got to start with a really healthy, strong commitment to looking at others, which means if you have a suffering or an experience of depression after a loss or grieving, I would rather say grieving, because I think depression can also be a much deeper psychological samskara, like mental, chemical, physiological position. So I'm not going to suggest that everybody could do this. And I'm going to acknowledge people really do live with depression, and Buddhism can help, but I don't think Buddhism should be a way to try to treat the depression necessarily. But when we're on the bodhisattva path, when we've already connected with teachings, when we've made very clear vows, the mind that we're cultivating then is a mind that is actually saying, I'm happy and I'm willing and able to accept the suffering, the non-virtues sometimes of others, which means the harm that they might do from a moment of anger, and give them my virtue, which means I have the healthiness of mind and quality of mind to not react and not to engage with that dynamic. That's a really strong, and that does take time to cultivate, but that's the practice of the Buddhist application of how we use mind training. Lojong, it's called mind training. But let's not, let's not expect people who have really severe depression to think that's something I'm going to do right now. But yes, to acknowledge the feelings, to acknowledge the state they're in with great compassion, to acknowledge that we ourselves have experienced sadness and loss, and that we can empathize, and to allow that to be without having to solve or heal it right away, because healing also takes a long time. The walk of the bodhisattva takes a long time, but people who have had like a broken leg with a cast, we can understand, oh, that bone needs to heal. But for psychological patterns and wounds, people, we can't really see those in one another. And we're really the first few generations that are even really talking about it in a healthy way. So we need to be really aware of this kind of bigger context we're in, and hold people where they are. But these are just some ideas I've shared from the Buddhist side, when we're really practicing and using our path to grow our qualities and be able to really, so from your side, Kat, sitting there as a Buddhist practitioner, then you've got, more tools and more awareness of, maybe helping yourself keep your therapist persona, how you're helping others there, and then your Buddhist persona, like that awareness can be held simultaneously.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sorry. I also feel that, we're using, when we talk about, let's say, depression or anxiety as a medical condition, also there is this, what Dasela was referring to was, these are two very different schools of thought. And sometimes we need to be careful how we bring them together. And can one simply fix another, so to speak, because it sounds wonderful. And I think we need to tread a little carefully there. The other part, I completely, when Dasela was speaking, was the idea of you don't teach someone to swim also when they're drowning. You want to, in some way, I feel we need to, and this comes back to the first question of saying what becomes suffering, is only the illness suffering, or do we see suffering as a broader, larger understanding of what suffering is, in which case we start questioning how we live, what mainstream life is about, what's being taught to us, even in educational institutes, what is not being taught to us. Are we cultivating healthy individuals, which leads to not just sustainable planets, but also thriving sentient beings, and I'm not completely convinced about this larger system as well. So perhaps there is some amount of thought which needs to be spent on how does one really bridge that gap? Because while we're training people to be great workers, I'm not sure we're necessarily training them to be people who think, feel, not just about themselves, but really suffering across the board, because it's not only me who suffers, right? And can I use my selfishness, but like all our kind teachers have repeatedly said, can I use it wisely? Because there's no way I can be this super happy person while everybody around me is really difficult and miserable. And in that sense, I recognize that I need to perhaps start shifting my perspective from I, me, my to perhaps what's going on around. And I feel even if I connect this back with our conversation about COVID, what COVID really demonstrated was we have no control. And this is something most teachers have been telling us for a long time. But, we've managed to delude ourselves saying, yeah, but, I really got this. And most days you may got this, but there are going to be many, many days and many, many things where we really don't got anything. I mean, you can't control your metabolism if you tried. I mean, it takes so many years of practice. So, we really need to cultivate that humility of saying, what can I really control? And if I really cannot even control my own mind, then how is it that I'm expecting, let's say, trauma from my childhood where I expected my parents or somebody else to behave differently? Is that expectation making sense when I cannot control my mind now, that they should have controlled their minds and their behaviors? Mm-hmm. And it led to unfair situations, yes. It led to pain and it led to suffering, of course, yes. But what is it that I can do now is really start saying, when I start shifting my own mind and when I start saying I can work on my own mind, it then gives me some hope to really broaden that understanding. Because otherwise, I've got this really narrow narrative of who I am, who those people who hurt me were, what my life is. And this narrow narrative really defines what I see all the time, how I interpret what I see, and then what I do with what I interpret and what I've seen, using it in some ways to almost feed into my narrative. And I think all of us have seen this. When you're depressed, for example, everything you see is probably going to get you more depressed. Or if you talk to somebody who deals with anxiety or who's an angry person, every situation is either feeding into that. So the same traffic signal where there's an angry person and an anxious person, the angry person's getting angry with the traffic and the anxious person's getting anxious about the traffic. I mean, if the anxiety or anger had to come from the traffic, I mean, by default, we all should be experiencing the same emotion. But we start recognizing that it's not so much the case. So much of this is our imprints and our ways of seeing the world that we've managed to say, now the world must match this. But sometimes I feel, even if we had the wisdom to say, would that really be a good thing? Even if the world was to match my mind state, when my mind state is small and it's not got a broad vision, and many times I know my own mind state may not be doing things which are good for me, much less the planet or much less the people around me, because none of us have omniscience. As parents today, I recognize there are so many times I'm doing things to my child with perhaps the bestest intention, but I have no control on what the outcome is going to be. And is it therefore even slightly possible that someone else may have also done things in some ways, thinking that this is going to work out well, whether it was being strict or being too liberal or not caring or whatever other aspects? We start broadening our understanding, which really helps, I feel, hold so many more truths within us. And I feel then we can slowly train our mind to just look a little bit at something else. And as we learn to look at something else, it really helps to broaden that view, move towards a long-term view. And again, using impermanence, because our habits came from so many causes and conditions. And today we've got different sets of causes and conditions which are holding it. But if I recognize them, I really need to tweak actually only one or two of them to get a different outcome, and we hold on because it's that impermanence which really gives us hope. So, yeah.
I love that. I love that. And it might be if anybody has some more comments or anything else to say, but I think that just ending on impermanence gives us hope is a lovely way to kind of conclude the talk. Does anybody else want to say anything else in conclusion? Because I think we have 5 minutes before we wrap up here.
I think one of my takeaway points from what we've spoken today really is to take a pause as Dr. Nivedita said, take a, a bit of a break. And how we take that break is what Venerable Tenzin was saying, just coming back to the breath, which is pretty reliable. Because if you say, oh, I have some other instruments on my phone, I might not have my phone at that time. But when you have your breath, it's with you practically all the time, isn't it? I'm assuming. So I think that's pretty handy. And it's something that it's quite easy to forget sometimes, but with your encouragement, you said it's okay, even if you just remember 2 days later, at least you're aware of it, and that can reduce slowly, as Stacey was saying, gradually. So that's kind of my takeaway in terms of recognizing actually impermanence and change can be so positive, just as, Venerable Tenzin had just brought in by example, and then moving forwards to that to help maybe get into that habit of pausing. And then as Stacey saying, are we, asking ourselves, are we being honest? Are we really seeing what's happening? And maybe that can help us create that space of hope, and makes that kind of positive change in how we manage uncertainty.
Yeah. Wonderful.
And yes, and thank you for all of these beautiful words of wisdom and insight and practical application. I think in the end, what we have to remember is, as much as we have great intentions in whatever roles we're playing in this life, as a sister, as a daughter, as a mother, as a friend, as a partner, really we can't change anybody else. Everything else is always constantly likewise within the process of change, but the only one we can change is this one. So if we really become more aware of becoming very skillful with that great compassion, loving kindness, wisdom, pure motivation, pure intention, to do the best we can and to rejoice, to take time to rejoice is so important. Rejoice that we've been changing ever since we appeared in this world. We changed because we didn't accept wearing nappies and diapers, and we learned to do things with our physical body to become an independent human being that is making contributions to the world, and not only in taking on responsibility for ourselves, but as mothers, all of you as mothers, or some of us as mothers, myself not, but taking on the responsibility of Dharma and being there for the Dharma as well as for all mother beings, means I'm wanting to make and actualize as many positive changes for that benefit of others and for the bigger vision as possible. And we can change. The Buddha said we can change. Change is the only thing that will be happening. So that holds within the possibility for our own, qualities of Buddha nature to come through, that immeasurable altruism of loving kindness, the immeasurable altruism of compassion, immeasurable altruism of sorrowless bliss, with equanimity that holds every wish for all beings to be beneficiaries of these qualities. But of course, we ourselves are not left out in that. It's not like, oh, I have to give it all away and get burnt out. It's like we get it first, and then everyone else gets the benefits. That's how it has to go. It starts inwardly here and then come outwardly. And then we really grow and mature and season to accept that, yes, impermanence sometimes brings feelings of loss and tragedy and big lessons because it gets our attention. But it also brings the capacity to look outwardly and say, just like me, no beings want the suffering. So may I become more skillful in becoming aware of my suffering through the emotions, through the body, through experience, to become much more open and really warm-hearted and there for others in every way I'm able to, possibly for them, without any kind of labels of friend, enemy, strangers, nationality, gender identities, politics, none of that, just with the pure motivation to recognize our commonality of wanting that deep happiness. And then that impermanence really does become like an ally, because we really take a very deep assessment of the preciousness of the human life, the preciousness of following, being connected with the Buddha Dharma, and then we can bring it into whatever relations we're in any situation. So thank you, my dear sisters. I have to say thank you to Sattva and to Brother Sherab and the people behind the scenes as well for creating this possibility for us to come together like this. And sorry for being a bit tardy, but yes, joyful perseverance, that's part of the 6 perfections of the perfection of effort. So keep the practice going like that.
And maybe it was meant to be. We really needed kind of a concrete example to work with. So it really gave us, something Translate the word. Yeah, thank you for doing
Surviving
that.
action, really.
Thanks for that happening. Okay.
And thanks for moderating, Stacey, Sister Stacey, for showing up and doing this. And I think you've done a wonderful, skillful job. So I hope we'll be able to reconvene, with more topics in the future, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I think, limitless topics for sure. Thank you so much, everybody. Kat, Dr. Nivedita, Venerable Tenzin Dasel, appreciate it so much. This was a great, wonderful way to start at least my Sunday morning. Okay.
May all
Alright.
beings benefit.
So I would like to once again thanks everyone for sharing your insight or such a crucial topic which somebody could contemplate over no matter what situation he or she is into. It was very nice to be able to listen to you all and once again bringing back to mind the most important topic, the most important phenomena I would say of impermanence and its different aspects and various in ways in which one could shift one's perspective towards this phenomena and thereby bring goodness to oneself and others. So thank you everyone. So before we conclude, let's have some announcement of upcoming events. So we'll be having a guided meditation on 9th of October, which will be on the topic a special transmission outside the sutras, which will be guided by Myung-An Soni. So okay. As always, I would like to invite every one of you to please give a short dedication prayer. So first of all, I would like to invite Venerable Tenzin Dasel.
Well, we dedicate the merits of this sharing and the virtue of this sharing to benefit all mother sentient beings in whichever way, whether they have tuned in and heard these conversations or not. May the bigger picture be held with loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, and joy, and the happiness and the pure motivation that all mother beings will benefit, and that these beautiful teachings of the Buddha Dharma will long remain to bring joy and happiness for all mother beings all the way up to their enlightenment. May it be so.
Dr. Nivedita.
I'll say something in terms of Diva's dedication there. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I remain to dispel the miseries of the world. May all beings everywhere find happiness, and may they be away from suffering. Thank you very much.
Sister,
Deep gratitude.
Sister Stacey.
Yes. May this discussion have a powerful positive impact on everybody who has listened or may listen in the future, or for all motherkind sentient beings everywhere.
Kat.
I'd like to share a Shantideva's dedication prayer. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of our merits. And for as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remains, until then, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Thank you, everyone.
The four great vows. Sentient beings are numberless. We vow to save them all. Delusions are endless. We vow to cut through them all. The teachings are infinite. We vow to learn them all. The Buddha way is inconceivable. We vow to attain it. May all beings be well, happy, and safe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.